Hey guys, tonight we're slipping beneath linen sheets, brushing off the desert sand and easing into one of the most titillating, misunderstood corners of the ancient world. Yes, tonight we're diving headfirst into what S3X was really like in ancient Egypt. Spoiler alert, it's not all Cleopatra lounging with grapes while toga-clad lovers fan her with ostrich feathers. No, it's steamier, weirder, and far more sacred than you might think. And let's be real, you probably won't survive this if you were actually there. Between intense heat, no running water, and the constant possibility of being cursed by an angry god for flirting with someone else's wife, the odds were not in your favour. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. That way, I don't have to beg, and you don't have to pretend. Also, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I want to know who else is up at this weird hour, contemplating what passed for foreplay 3,000 years ago. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You arrive at the Nile just as the sun starts to slip behind a palm-dotted horizon. The air is thick with the scent of lotus, damp, and something faintly sweet. Maybe date wine, maybe crushed rose petals. This isn't the Egypt of mummies and war chariots. This is the after-hours Egypt, where household doors creak closed and laughter floats from the rooftops. People are slipping into their finest linen, the kind soaked in perfume, so thin it clings to every contour. The desert cools at night, but the mood heats up. From the humblest farming village to the gleaming palaces of Thebes, sexuality is woven into every layer of life here. You don't just stumble into it, it's built into your religion, your architecture, your furniture. That bed, probably carved with fertility symbols, that amulet dangling from your neck, might be invoking Hathor, goddess of love, music, and very enthusiastic reproduction. In ancient Egypt, intimacy is not taboo. It's divine, necessary, and frankly everywhere you look. Picture the temple walls. Some are covered in hieroglyphs praising gods and pharaohs. Yes, but others feature carvings of celestial unions so detailed they make modern viewers blink twice. One prominent myth: the sun god Atum created the world through an act of, personal affection. You're told this with a straight face by a priest, who then gestures meaningfully at a statue that has, let's say, bold anatomy. You're not just here to worship, you're being reminded that creation, pleasure, and sacred power are all intimately linked. And people take their cues from the gods. If Osiris and Isis can tear apart the cosmos to be together again, even if Osiris was literally dismembered, then mortal passion had better live up. Couples learn from these myths, but they also learn from each other. Teenage boys sneak peeks at love poetry etched on potsherds. Girls practice elaborate makeup rituals, not just to look good, but to send a message. I've got access to sacred oils and I know exactly what to do with them. The culture doesn't just tolerate desire, it cultivates it. Even the concept of marriage, which we'll get into more later, is infused with the sacred. There's not always a big ceremony. Often it's just two people agreeing to live together, maybe with a contract signed before witnesses, maybe with just a quiet understanding. But once they do, sex isn't something tucked away behind curtains. It's expected, it's celebrated, and it's something everyone, from scribe to shepherd, knows is part of the natural holy rhythm of life. But don't get the wrong idea. Just because it's sacred doesn't mean it's sanitized. This is still a world with heated jealousy, dramatic love triangles, and the occasional poison-laced amulet slipped into someone's wine. Affairs happen, gossip spreads, and if you're not careful, you might find yourself on the business end of a curse scroll. Let's pause here and take in a few crunchy facts for context. First, the historical nugget. Egyptian love poetry from around 1300 BCE is some of the oldest in the world. One poem describes a lover's breath as sweeter than beer, which is both romantic and weirdly specific. Then there's a fringe fact. During certain festivals, especially those honouring Hathor or Bastet, drinking and sexuality were encouraged as part of spiritual celebration, like Mardi Gras, but with more leopards and fertility statues. And the scholarly debate? Well, archaeologists still argue about how literally to interpret those more graphic wall scenes in places like Deir el Medina. Are they sacred, satirical, just ancient bedroom graffiti. The jury's still out. Back to your desert evening. As night deepens, torches flicker. Couples sneak onto rooftops to talk, flirt, or more. You hear snatches of song, some playful, some longing. Even children know the rhythm of courtship, watching older siblings braid their hair with scented oils or dab crushed jasmine on their wrists. You notice a boy carving something into a smooth clay tablet. You peek. It's a very detailed sketch of two lovers, complete with exaggerated parts and surprisingly accurate expressions. You glance at him. He just shrugs. It's for practice, he says. There's no shame here, not really. Just a quiet confidence in the naturalness of it all. The Nile rises, the crops grow, people fall in love, have sex, and hopefully make babies who will honour them in death. And even when they pass on, they're buried with amulets to ensure they'll keep enjoying the pleasures of life, in this world and the next. So as you lie back on your stiff linen mattress under a sky spilling with stars, you're reminded, here in ancient Egypt, sex isn't a secret, it's a sacrament, and tonight, it's only just beginning. You wake up to the slow warmth of the Egyptian sun stretching across your skin, slipping through the thin slats of a reed window. Someone down the street is grinding barley, someone else is singing a song you recognise as a half-flirty prayer to Hathor. It's morning, but intimacy doesn't punch a clock here. In fact, if you're paying attention, you'll realise that sex and sensuality are less of a nighttime activity and more of a permanent undercurrent to everyday life. And today, you're about to see how the gods got involved, intimately. Unlike some ancient cultures that separated the divine from the dirty, the Egyptians let the two roll around together in the desert dust. Their gods didn't just create life, they modelled how to live it, with passion, drama, and a very healthy appetite for connection. If you were an ancient Egyptian, you'd grow up hearing stories where gods didn't just rule the cosmos. They had heated love affairs, passionate reconciliations, and at least one very awkward creation moment involving solo activity. In this world, even the act of divine creation had a sexual tone. The cosmos wasn't spoken into existence, it was, coaxed out through pleasure. You stop by a temple later that morning, partly out of curiosity, partly because you're still trying to figure out why no one flinches when these myths are retold in front of kids. The priest greets you with the calmness of someone who's seen too many sunrises and possibly too many fertility statues. He leads you past towering columns etched with mythological scenes, gods with exaggerated limbs, goddesses in flowing gowns bent toward their lovers. There's Isis, magic in her eyes, using her grief and erotic energy to reassemble Osiris, her husband and brother, from scattered body parts. And not just symbolically, she literally puts him back together, except, well, for one specific piece, which had been tossed in the Nile and eaten by a fish. Undeterred, Isis fashions a new one, a golden one, then uses it. The result? Horus, their divine son. And that's not even the weirdest part. You take in the myth of Atum, the creator god, who brought the world into being by, how shall we say, engaging in a solo act of divine self-expression. Yes, the original Big Bang involved a god pleasuring himself on a cosmic scale. The Egyptians weren't scandalized by this. In fact, this act was reenacted ceremonially, sometimes in very public ways. According to some scholars, during the annual flooding of the Nile, pharaohs might have mimicked Atum's generative act to bless the river and ensure fertility. Imagine your local politician doing that to bless the city reservoir. The gods of Egypt loved boldly, lusted publicly, and held nothing back. The love between Nut, the sky goddess, and Geb, the earth god, was so intense that their bodies had to be separated by force so the world could even exist. Nut, curved above like a deep blue canopy speckled with stars, still reaches for Geb each night. It's sensual, tragic, and epic in scale. All at once. The messages are loud and clear. Love is divine, sex is power, and both are holy. You notice it even in the architecture. Many temples are designed with long, narrow halls that widen into open sanctuaries, interpreted by some as metaphors for fertility, or even the female body. The deeper you go into a temple, the more sacred, and often more sensual the imagery becomes. Statues of gods often come with overtly sexual symbolism, erect forms, exaggerated curves, lotus blossoms in just the right places. It's all on purpose. This doesn't mean the Egyptians were all lounging around in orgies 24/7, but it does mean they weren't tiptoeing around sexuality either. It was celebrated, ritualized, and embedded in their worldview. And where did that leave you, the average mortal? Well, you'd better know your myths, because if you wanted divine favour, whether for love, fertility, or just a little extra charm at the marketplace, you'd be invoking these gods regularly. You walk through a crowded market as the day wears on, weaving between baskets of dates and jars of perfumed oil. A woman selling amulets holds one up to you. For desire, she says with a sly smile, the kind that makes your lover never leave your side. It's a carved image of Bez, the squat, lion-faced god of music, dance, and all things pleasurable. He's got a little smirk on his face, and you get the impression he knows things. You buy it. Here's your historical fact for the day. In ancient Egyptian religion, many major deities had overt sexual attributes. Min, for example, was the god of fertility and male potency, often shown with a very prominent erection and lettuce in hand. Yes, lettuce, which was considered an aphrodisiac. His statues were placed in fields to ensure a good harvest, which says a lot about how closely the Egyptians linked sex and survival. Now, for something a little more off the beaten papyrus. Some fringe scholars believe that certain priesthoods might have practiced sacred sexuality, not just metaphorically, but literally, as a form of ritual devotion. These ideas are debated heavily and often sensationalized, but it raises intriguing questions about the role of eroticism in public religious life. Were temple dancers and priestesses simply entertainers, or were they conduits for divine union? The answer's blurry, and that brings us to our scholarly debate. Was sex in temples ever really practiced as ritual, or are we projecting modern assumptions onto ancient texts and art? Some Egyptologists say yes, particularly in fertility cults. Others say it's all metaphor, no more literal than stained glass windows in a cathedral. You leave the market with a small bundle of amulets, your little Bez figure, and about 6 new stories about gods who really needed a couples therapist. But what sticks with you isn't the shock factor. It's how naturally all of this fits into everyday life. There's no moral panic, no whispering behind hands, just a culture where love, lust, creation, and devotion swirl together like ink in the Nile. By nightfall, you're back in your borrowed home, watching the stars wheel overhead again. Somewhere, a couple is whispering under a thatched awning. A child is giggling at a carved story stone showing Hathor dancing naked at a feast. And you, still holding your smirking best charm, are beginning to understand that in ancient Egypt sex wasn't behind closed doors. It was written in the stars, sculpted into the gods, and etched deep into the stone walls of every sacred place. The night air in the village is still, thick with the scent of crushed mint and the slow burn of oil lamps. And you're starting to realise that ancient Egypt doesn't just blur the line between the sacred and the sensual, it smashes right through it. If you thought last night's tales about divine intimacy were bold, wait until you hear the creation story. Let's just say, it's not something you'd expect to be chiselled in stone and recited with reverence. You're sitting in the shade of a sycamore fig, the tree sacred to Hathor, and a temple scribe offers to tell you how everything began. You lean in, half expecting a grand poetic origin story involving cosmic eggs or exploding stars. But no, this is Egypt, and they take a very personal approach to creation. It starts with Atum, the primordial god, standing alone on the watery void called Nun. There's no one else, just Atum, the dark, still chaos, and the growing awareness that something needs to happen. So, naturally, Atum decides to create life, by pleasuring himself. That's right. The official cosmic beginning, according to the Heliopolitan creation myth, begins with a solo act of divine satisfaction. The gods Shu and Tefnut, air and moisture, are born from this act, and from them, the rest of the universe unfolds. There's even a moment where Atum spits or sneezes them out, depending on which version you hear. The act isn't hidden or coy, it's celebrated in temple inscriptions carved with care and reverence. You glance around, wondering if anyone else is as confused as you, but the locals take it in stride. For them, this isn't awkward, it's deeply symbolic. Atum's body is the universe, and his pleasure is the engine that starts it all. Creation through desire, not domination. The scribe explains that this wasn't just a myth whispered in sacred corners. It was reenacted, spoken, and even potentially dramatized during temple festivals. Pharaohs, as living embodiments of Horus and heirs to divine power, sometimes performed symbolic acts mimicking Atum's creation to ensure fertility and cosmic balance. There are whispers that during the Apet festival or certain New Year rituals, these ceremonies got very literal. Scholars still debate whether that's just poetic license or if royal chambers occasionally doubled as ritual theatres. But here's a twist. Even within all this divine erotica, there's a weird humility. Atum created the world alone, not because he was too proud to ask for help, but because he was the only being. It's less arrogance and more existential necessity. There's a loneliness in the story, a strange undertone that maybe even gods crave connection. You start to realise that these tales, graphic as they may be, aren't meant to be shocking. They're teaching tools. They map out the building blocks of the cosmos with erotic symbolism, because to the Egyptians, sex isn't just about pleasure. It's about creation, restoration, and the renewal of life itself. As you walk back through the village, you pass a group of young boys carving crude figures into pieces of limestone. One of them snickers and shows you a little statue with an enormous phallus. It's Min, god of fertility. He made the lettuce grow, one of the boys says with a grin. You nod slowly, unsure if he's joking. He's not. Min was honoured with lettuce offerings during his festivals. Lettuce, especially the tall, upright variety, was linked with male arousal, mostly because of the way it secretes a milky sap when cut. Subtlety, not exactly a priority here. Still, even with all this openness, you sense there are rules. These myths aren't licensed for chaos. They're structured, symbolic, and surrounded by ritual. The temple walls might depict gods in suggestive poses, but they're not pornographic. They're layered with meaning. Every gesture, every image, echoes a cosmic truth or an agricultural cycle. The arousal of the land, the fertility of the Nile, the continuation of kingship, it's all encoded in these acts. The line between metaphor and action blurs, but it always serves a larger purpose. And then, the priest tells you one last version of the creation myth, and this one goes even weirder. In some rare texts, Atum doesn't just create Shu and Tefnut from his own body. He does so by using his hand, which is personified as a goddess. Yes, his own hand becomes a separate divine being, a kind of cosmic consort. The scribe recites this part with the same solemn tone he uses when describing funerary rites. You stare at him, baffled. So, Atum and his hand, you ask. He nods. Of course, all creation comes from union, even imagined ones. This, it turns out, is your quirky fringe fact. In one version of Egyptian mythology, the world was created through divine masturbation with a personified hand. That's not a modern interpretation. That's from temple hymns, with the goddess hand sometimes named Usaset, the great one who comes forth. Scholars aren't entirely sure what to make of this. Is it symbolic of self-sufficiency, a metaphysical representation of duality and oneness? Or was it just a myth that got carried away? The debate is ongoing, and this brings us to the academic scuffle of the day. There's a lingering argument in Egyptology about how literal to take these myths. Are we supposed to imagine Atum as a cosmic being going through very human motions? Or is this all symbolic shorthand for energy manifesting into matter? Some argue these sexual myths are poetic metaphors for creation forces. Others insist that the Egyptians saw no conflict in describing the sacred through very earthly, even graphic terms. The line between metaphor and action, again, is razor thin, maybe deliberately so. As dusk falls, you join a local family for dinner. Flatbread, lentils, beer that's more chunky than fizzy. Afterward, someone puts on a performance for the kids, a puppet show reenacting the birth of the world. Atum appears, a painted wooden figure with exaggerated features, and pantomimes his lonely act of creation while the audience giggles and claps. No one shields the children's eyes, no one blushes. Here, creation is funny, powerful, and revered all at once. Before you turn in for the night, you glance again at the sky, Nut stretched across the heavens, reaching down for Geb below. Even the cosmos can't keep its hands to itself, and somewhere deep in the heart of a temple a statue of Atum stands tall, watching over a world he made not with violence or war, but with pleasure, solitude, and a very creative use of anatomy. You're starting to notice that in ancient Egypt nothing about sex is merely carnal. It's always cloaked in something bigger, something sacred, something theatrical. So when you hear whispers about sacred seduction rituals, your curiosity spikes hard. It turns out that temples weren't just places for somber prayers and animal sacrifices. They were also stages where the divine and erotic intersected in performances that, frankly, make modern religious services look like tax seminars. You head to a temple dedicated to Hathor, the goddess of love, music, beauty, and drunken festivals. Her followers call her the mistress of the vulva, which is exactly as unsubtle as it sounds. The priests, many of whom are actually priestesses, dancers, musicians, and ritual specialists, are preparing for one of Hathor's festivals, and you're told to sit quietly in the outer court. No talking, no laughing, and definitely no touching anything, someone warns, pointing to a nearby statue that might have cursed someone last week. As the sun dips low, a slow rhythm begins to echo off the sandstone walls, deep drums, reed flutes, clapping. Then, the priestesses appear. They're dressed in sheer linen dyed with saffron, perfumed to the point that you can smell them before you see them. Their movements are slow, intentional, somewhere between dance and invocation. They don't just sway, they radiate seduction with the gravity of a solar flare. You're not just watching a performance, you're watching a reenactment of divine union. Each dancer represents a goddess, each movement a step toward harmony between the masculine and feminine. One raises her arms like the wings of Isis, another imitates the cowhorn crown of Hathor. Slowly they circle a tall statue of Min, the fertility god, who stands erect, very literally. The ceremony builds, growing more hypnotic, more heated, until the lead dancer kneels and kisses the base of the statue. The crowd lets out a collective exhale, half awe, half longing. No one's pretending this isn't erotic, but it's not only erotic, it's reverent, ritualized. It's theatre with cosmic implications. The idea is simple. By reenacting the sacred seduction between gods, the people renew the fertility of the land. The temple is the body. The dance is the act. The pleasure is prayer. You later learn this kind of sacred theatre wasn't isolated to Hathor's cult. At Edfu, during the Festival of the Beautiful Reunion, the statue of Hathor was physically carried from her temple at Dendera to visit Horus, her lover, at Edfu. The two statues were placed together in the inner sanctum, and everyone agreed in hushed tones that yes, they were sleeping together. Symbolically, of course. Probably. Maybe. During this time, the entire town erupted into days-long feasts, drinking and music, all under the banner of sacred joy. You begin to understand, these people aren't worshipping despite their desires, they're worshipping through them. The ceremonies are rich with metaphor, lotus blossoms representing female sexuality, papyrus reeds signifying male virility. The chants echo with longing and release. It's said that in the innermost chambers of certain temples, only the high priest and priestess could enter, performing rituals that scholars today can't fully reconstruct. Were they symbolic? Was there touching? Were they channeling deities or simply embodying them in a ritual roleplay that blurred the lines of identity? This, naturally, is your scholarly debate for the day. Some archaeologists argue that these temple rites involved actual sexual acts, performed as sacred dramas to mirror the union of gods. Others insist they were symbolic, gestures, words, and dances that evoked intimacy without crossing into it. But then there are those cryptic wall paintings, those vague hymns, and those little rooms behind sanctuaries that seem way too cozy for quiet meditation. There's no clear answer, and maybe that's the point. Mystery was part of the magic. As you wander the temple later, you notice graffiti on a rear wall, scratched quickly, probably by a worker or low-level scribe. It's not a prayer. It's a crude image of two people entangled beneath a scribbled lotus. Even here, outside the sanctioned rituals, desire leaves its mark. You ask a passing guide if that kind of graffiti was common. She just smirks. Even the gods need entertainment, she says. There's also a fringe fact you can't quite shake. In some temples, particularly those connected to fertility cults, it's believed that visitors could pay for ritual experiences with temple priestesses, less transactional than they sound, more like spiritual consultations with, let's say, tactile elements. Some texts hint that these weren't considered sex work in the modern sense, but were acts of healing, prophecy, or even communion. Fringe theory? Maybe, but a compelling one. Back outside, the air is thick with incense and arousal. You feel both grounded and slightly unmoored. If this were modern life, someone would have thrown a scandalized fit by now. But here, sex isn't deviant, it's divine choreography. The priestesses aren't dancers, they're channels. The audience isn't ogling, they're participating. Even watching becomes an act of reverence. Before you leave, a novice priestess presses something into your hand, a small amulet of Hathor in gold-painted faience. Her eyes are lined with kohl, her breasts exposed, her face serene. "Keep her close," the girl whispers. "She teaches joy." You nod, already tucking it into your belt. You understand now. Here, joy is not trivial. Joy is how the world is made. The sun is setting again. A couple nearby begins to sway to a lingering drumbeat. You catch a glimpse of a man lifting a small offering of perfume to his partner's neck, and she leans into it like a flower in bloom. There's no shame here, no hiding. Just rhythm, perfume, skin, and breath. Just people reenacting the cosmic dance, night after sacred night. By the time the sun climbs high over the desert, your brain's been thoroughly marinated in the idea that the gods were basically soap opera stars with celestial libidos. But what about actual people? Regular Egyptians with regular jobs and regular urges. That's where today's thread leads. Not through temple halls or mythic reenactments, but straight into the bedrooms, hearts, and poetic papyri of the average ancient Egyptian. Because while the gods set the stage, it was everyday men and women who had to actually live it out. And you're about to find out how. You're sitting by a small canal, watching fishermen haul in their morning catch as a woman kneels nearby weaving reeds into baskets. She's humming a tune that sounds suspiciously like the love poems you've been hearing scraps of. You ask her about it, and without missing a beat she starts to recite a verse. It is her voice that makes my limbs weak, as when a gazelle comes near the hunter's bow. You blink. That's not a nursery rhyme. That's full-on seduction, and she's smiling because she knows you're impressed. Ancient Egyptian love poetry is some of the oldest, and honestly most tender, erotic writing in the world. Composed mostly during the New Kingdom period, these poems show that while pharaohs were busy with conquest and priestesses were invoking cosmic union, ordinary people were out here writing odes to freckles, ankle bracelets, and the way a lover's scent clings to your clothes long after they're gone. One line describes a woman's desire so strong that she says, "Would that I were her laundryman, even for a day," which is both adorable and weirdly domestic. You soon realise that these poems aren't just one-sided. Women speak freely in them, their voices strong, yearning, sometimes blunt. They fantasize, flirt, initiate. One young girl describes walking by her crush's house over and over, pretending she has errands just to catch his eye. Another compares her longing to the weight of water jars she can barely carry. The messages are clear. Egyptian women were not passive objects of male attention. They were active agents in their romantic and sexual lives. And this wasn't just literary fantasy. Gender roles in Egypt were surprisingly progressive by ancient standards. Women could own property, initiate divorce, run businesses, and yes, pursue the object of their affection. That doesn't mean everything was equal. Men still had structural advantages. But compared to their contemporaries in Greece or Mesopotamia, Egyptian women had more freedom and more voice, both in law and in love. You duck into a modest home built of mud brick and plaster. It's small, just a couple of rooms and a rooftop for sleeping on hot nights, but there's a painted ostracon leaning against the wall. It shows a woman handing a man a lotus flower, an ancient symbol of sensuality. You're told this is the home of a scribe's family, and the scene on the shard isn't just decoration, it's a wink. Lotus flowers open at sunrise and close at sunset, and their fragrance was considered a literal aphrodisiac. Giving someone a lotus was like texting a heart emoji, only with more fragrance and potentially bigger consequences. Later you stroll through the village and notice another couple. The man is older, maybe in his 40s, and the woman barely out of her teens. They're chatting casually, sharing a piece of fruit. You wonder if this is a marriage or something more casual. In ancient Egypt, both could be true. While formal marriages existed, many couples simply moved in together. What mattered more than ceremony was mutual consent, and a working understanding of expectations. Some relationships were passionate and brief, others were long and quietly stable, and through it all, seduction wasn't just a one-time act, it was an ongoing dance. Here's your historical fact. Egyptian love poems often refer to clothing in ways that suggest flirtation or undressing, but what's striking is how much they also emphasize emotion. Passion is not just physical, It's psychological, even spiritual. "My heart flutters when I see you," says one verse. "I cannot even hold my own jug." Clumsiness becomes a metaphor for longing, and physical desire is often framed as a kind of sacred madness. You can't fake that. And now, for the quirky fact of the day, there was an entire class of spells and charms meant to inspire, or control desire. Some involved inscribing a lover's name on a piece of meat, spitting on it, and feeding it to a cat, because apparently nothing says eternal devotion like enchanted leftovers. Other spells instructed the user to mix wine with mandrake root or wild lettuce, both believed to be aphrodisiacs. Whether these worked or just made everyone hallucinate is still up for debate. Which leads us to our open scholarly question. Did ancient Egyptians distinguish sharply between romantic love and physical attraction? Some experts argue that the poetry suggests they did, speaking often of the heart, the soul, the sweetness of shared glances. Others believe that all these layers were part of a single, inseparable whole, with love and lust existing side by side in an easy rhythm. After all, when your entire religious system revolves around the central world, it's hard to draw a neat line between body and spirit. As evening creeps in, you're invited to a small gathering, a courtyard lit by flickering oil lamps, with wine passed in ceramic cups and music played on lyres and flutes. It's not a wild party, but there's a soft sensuality in the air, unspoken but understood. A young man quotes part of a poem as he pours a drink for his companion. "Her lips are pomegranate wine," he says, eyes lingering just a second too long. She smiles but doesn't reply. She doesn't have to. Everything is already in motion. You're beginning to see that seduction here isn't about conquest. It's about rhythm, subtle, steady, undeniable. A look, a gesture, a poem recited under one's breath, the way scent clings to a linen shawl. These people didn't rush their desire. They let it grow slowly like the river swelling after the rains. And when the moment came, it wasn't explosive. It was inevitable. Later you lie on a rooftop, stars above, thoughts churning. The poetry echoes in your mind, each line stitched with longing and softness. This isn't some forgotten past. It's the eternal human game of how to want and be wanted. The only difference. In ancient Egypt, they never apologize for the wanting. The morning hits like a warm exhale from the gods themselves, thick with incense, heat, and the faint aroma of date syrup frying on a stone griddle. You wander into the heart of a market street already pulsing with life, vendors haggling, oxen snorting, sandals slapping the stone, and yet amidst the clamour something more subtle stirs. Desire, cloaked in kohl, draped in perfume, peeking out from behind layers of linen that conceal just enough to tease. In ancient Egypt, fashion wasn't just function, it was foreplay. You stop in front of a stall overflowing with small ceramic jars and alabaster vials. The merchant, a woman with a braided wig and eyes lined in sharp black kohl that could cut through fog, beckons you closer. She lifts the stopper on one jar and holds it beneath your nose. The scent punches upward, spicy, heady, floral, like honey soaked in cedarwood. "Kiffy," she says, "burn it, wear it, or let it drip down your lover's back." You do a double take, but she's already moving on, swirling resinous paste onto her own wrist like she's preparing for something, or someone. In ancient Egypt, beauty and scent were not just aesthetic pursuits. They were tools of seduction, spiritual markers, and sometimes literal invitations. Your sweat smells. Fix it. Your breath offends. Chew myrrh. Your linen hangs limp and odourless. Add crushed lotus petals. Everything from cosmetics to deodorant to hairstyling was part of a larger language of desire, and everyone, from peasants to queens, spoke it fluently. You pass a young man leaning against a column, absent-mindedly rolling a bronze mirror across his palm. His face is powdered, his lips tinted slightly red, and his armpits glisten with oil. You think he might be a dancer, maybe a priest, but one thing is clear. He's not just getting ready to work, he's preparing to be seen. In this society, looking good wasn't vanity, it was respect. For others, yes, but also for the divine. Looking attractive was almost a religious duty. You find yourself in front of a home where women are bathing in a shallow courtyard pool, scrubbing their skin with natron salts and smooth stones. One of them beckons you closer, holds up a cone-shaped item that looks like a lump of wax. "Perfume cone," she explains. "You wear it on your head at parties, melts slowly, everyone notices." She laughs at your expression. "No one wants to smell like the Nile in summer. You nod quickly. You've smelled the Nile in summer. This brings us to your historical tidbit. Ancient Egyptians were among the earliest known cultures to obsess over hygiene and scent. Perfume was everywhere, made from frankincense, myrrh, cinnamon, lotus, and a dozen other lush ingredients steeped in oil. Wealthier people even had personal scent keepers, assistants responsible for maintaining one's olfactory aura throughout the day. Talk about luxury. But here's the fringe detail that makes you pause. Certain perfumes were believed to stir lust directly, not metaphorically, but physically. One famous recipe, allegedly from a temple of Hathor, involved fermenting a blend of blue lotus, mandrake, wine, and something that translated loosely as goat tears. The result? A tonic worn behind the ears that was rumoured to inspire uncontrollable arousal in whoever inhaled it. Naturally, some people wore it everywhere. Others ended up regretting it. You head into a shop specialising in wigs, rows upon rows of hairpieces ranging from tight black curls to flowing honey-coloured strands. A teenaged apprentice explains how wigs were not just fashion statements, but vital to seduction. They concealed real hair, exaggerated status, and often came perfumed or dusted with gold powder. And sometimes, she says, lowering her voice, we sew small charms into them. Love spells, even control spells. You don't ask for clarification. You already know magic and beauty are kissing cousins here. This leads us into today's scholarly tangle. Were ancient cosmetics just cosmetic? Or were they spiritual tools as well? Some researchers argue that makeup, especially eye paint like green malachite and black coal, had protective magic against the evil eye, and perhaps even medicinal properties. Others think it was mostly about aesthetic signalling and erotic play. But the truth might be both. When you line your eyes to resemble the falcon god Horus, you're not just getting ready for a date, you're invoking cosmic protection, and also looking very hot doing it. You notice the small things too. Rings that double as seals, necklaces carved with symbols for love or fertility. Even the way people walk, shoulders back, chins high, like they know they're being watched. A young man selling pomegranates throws a flirty smile at a passing girl. She pauses just long enough for it to matter. He returns to his stall whistling. It's not just about looking good, it's about sending a message. A slick of oil across the collarbone says, I'm ready. A braid laced with beads says, notice me. A linen dress clinging in just the right way under the sun says, you may look, but only if I let you. And those messages don't need translating. They were understood 3,000 years ago, and you understand them now. As the afternoon stretches, you wander through a perfumery where an older woman sits cross-legged, mashing petals with a mortar and pestle. She hands you a dab of something smoky and warm, and your mind immediately floods with images, skin, breath, shadows. That one's for remembering a lover, she says. You'll see. And just like that, you're trapped in it too. The ancient Egyptians understood something modern people often forget. Attraction isn't just visual, it's scent, sound, texture. The way linen rustles when you walk, the curve of an anklet glinting in the sun, the touch of oil applied to your own neck, half for yourself, half for the one you hope might notice. Desire was never an accident here. It was an art. Carefully mixed, gracefully worn, confidently performed. By nightfall the market dims, and the scent of kefi still lingers in your hair. You've never been so aware of your own skin, or the way the wind moves against it. You realise that in this world, attraction isn't chaste, it's curated. It's not about who's the loudest. It's about who knows exactly how to leave a trace behind. As night melts into soft velvet and the torches flicker to life along the narrow alleyways, you find yourself quietly wondering, where did all this desire actually happen? Not in a general sense, but in the practical everyday logistics of things. Because for all the divine metaphors and perfumed oils, sooner or later you need a bed, a door that closes, and preferably little privacy, right? But you're about to learn a hard truth about ancient Egypt. Privacy is a scam, and everyone is always kind of around. The houses are small, let's start there. Even in bustling urban centres like Thebes or Memphis, your average home was 2 to 4 rooms, often built vertically with a flat roof, and no real insulation to muffle sounds. You climb into one such house in a workers' village not far from the Valley of the Kings. The ground floor is for cooking and animals. The second floor, barely large enough to stretch out your arms, serves as the communal living and sleeping space. Mum, Dad, the kids, maybe a cousin or two, and sometimes the neighbours, all snoring on mats a few feet apart. There are no bedroom doors, no hushed soundproofing, no ambient Spotify playlist to mask anything. If you're feeling in the mood, you either have to wait until everyone else is asleep or just try to be subtle about it, which sounds impossible, and yet somehow they made it work. You're told that the rooftop was a popular option. On hot nights, entire families slept under the stars, and couples would quietly separate from the group, slipping to a shadowy corner to steal a moment together. Sometimes privacy wasn't a physical space, it was an agreement. Everyone pretended not to hear. You did your business, and in the morning, nobody talked about it unless you really got carried away. That brings us to a weird but true fact. In some houses, the best chance for privacy might have been the granary. Tucked behind the main structure, often empty late at night and reasonably insulated with bags of grain, it made for a surprisingly effective romantic hideaway, which is both resourceful and extremely on brand for a society that practically worshipped wheat. Even wealthier homes, those owned by scribes, merchants or priests, weren't exactly sprawling mansions. You might have a separate sleeping chamber, maybe even a bed carved from sycamore with lion's feet, and a woven mat for comfort. But unless you lived in a palace, someone was still probably within earshot. You peek into one such house, and there's a bedroom, right next to the courtyard where kids are playing with clay dolls. The walls are mud brick, the curtains are linen. It's the architectural equivalent of whispering your secrets through paper. So how did desire survive in such cramped quarters? The answer is creatively. Lovers became experts in timing, meeting at the riverbank while fetching water, slipping away to a storage shed, or getting lost on a walk to the temple. The Nile's edge, by the way, was practically a hookup zone. Warm breezes, rustling reeds, and a cultural norm that didn't criminalise sensuality. Here's your historical fact for the day. Depictions of couples in tomb art often show them seated closely, arm round shoulder, touching faces, intimate gestures for the time. These scenes weren't just decorative, they were aspirational. You wanted to be remembered as someone who loved well, even in death. That's how valued emotional and physical connection was. Now for the quirky fringe discovery. At the workman's village of Deir el-Medina, archaeologists found a house with what they believed was a purposefully elevated platform behind a curtain. Maybe the ancient world's version of a bedroom nook. One theory, it was a semi-private space for couples to be alone, or at least alone enough. You imagine a couple slipping behind that curtain trying not to giggle, knowing their parents are still talking downstairs. It's timeless, really. And here's the scholarly debate that keeps Egyptologists up at night. Were Egyptian norms about sex really as relaxed as they seem, or are we misreading the evidence? On one side, the abundance of love poetry, erotic amulets, and temple carvings suggests a culture comfortable with sexuality. But some argue that this openness was limited to religious or artistic contexts, and that daily life still maintained social modesty, especially in family settings. It's hard to say, because the records we have are usually from tombs, temples, or legal papyri, not from diary entries or whispered gossip. You wander through a wealthier estate on the outskirts of Memphis, where the owner, a successful trader, has 2 wives, 4 children, and a rotating staff of servants. Here, you notice something new, separate chambers for each wife, not out of generosity, but logistics. The rotation system isn't romantic, but it's efficient. Each woman gets her night. The children are taught not to interrupt, and the staff knows not to eavesdrop. But of course, they do. And you suspect that half the drama of this household happens not in the bedrooms, but outside them. At one point, a young servant girl tells you that she once watched her mistress leave a flower outside her husband's chamber door, a silent signal. He came to her room that night, and the next morning there was a new necklace around her neck. It's all very quiet, very practiced, very strategic. Romance in a crowded house requires a plan. Later you return to the village rooftops, where couples begin drifting apart from the communal chatter as stars emerge like embers across the sky. A woman leads her partner by the hand to the far edge, silhouetted by the moonlight. There's no curtain, no door, no soft music, just the understanding that this moment is theirs. And no one interrupts, because they get it. They've all been there. Everyone in this world has played this game of hush and timing, of looking casual while your heart slams around inside your chest like an anxious scarab. You lie back on the warm plaster rooftop and wonder if this was all normal to them. If the lack of privacy simply sharpened their attention, made every whisper sweeter, every glance more charged. In a way, the scarcity made it sacred. You don't waste moments like this when you have to fight. For them, in ancient Egypt, privacy may have been rare, but that only made desire burn brighter. Morning in the village rises not with quiet birdsong or subtle stretches, but with the rhythmic creak of grinding stones, the chatter of neighbours already halfway into their chores, and the occasional chicken losing its mind for no clear reason. It's another day in ancient Egypt, and while everything smells faintly of baking bread and sun-warmed dust, today you're heading into something a little more formal than flirtation. It's time to talk about marriage, not the mythic unions of Isis and Osiris or the suggestive rooftop rendezvous from last night, but real, legally bound, relationship in ink and wax kind of marriage. And let's be clear, it's not always romantic, but it is extremely practical. You start your morning seated cross-legged in a small scribe's office, tucked between a grain storehouse and a potter's kiln. Papyrus scrolls are stacked like stale pancakes, and a nervous young man stands by the desk as the scribe sharpens his reed pen. The man is here to get married, not in a ceremony, not with rings or flower crowns, but with a contract. A literal list of expectations, responsibilities and promises, all meticulously recorded. You lean closer as the scribe reads aloud. He shall provide her with oil, grain, and 1 measure of clothing per year. She shall bear his children and keep his house. There's a clause about what happens if she cheats, she loses a portion of the dowry, and another if he cheats, he pays compensation. It's all very businesslike. And that's your first real insight. Ancient Egyptian marriage was more about household stability and social status than eternal romance. It was a practical alliance, a way to ensure continuity, property inheritance, and legitimacy. There might be love, often there was, but even love had to pass through the bureaucratic eye of the state. Want to spend your life with someone? Better make sure they can help you churn flour and raise 3 healthy kids, while still being on good terms with your in-laws. But here's the surprise twist. These contracts weren't one-sided. Women had rights, lots of them. A wife could retain her own property, and many contracts explicitly stated what she was owed in the event of a divorce. One papyrus found near Asyut reads, "If he sends her away, she shall take her dowry and half the goods acquired during the marriage." Half. In the 3rd millennium BCE, eat your heart out modern prenups. You flip through another document where the wife, not the husband, initiated the divorce. She simply left the home, took her belongings, and informed the court. No scandal, no scarlet letters, just a legal process that viewed marriage as dissolvable by either party. That doesn't mean breakups were painless. There were still broken hearts, jealous neighbours, and disputes over who got to keep the family goat. But it wasn't taboo. Divorce was just life. Still, contracts alone didn't guarantee happiness. You're invited to visit the home of an older woman named Henty, who's been married for 30 years. Her back is slightly bent, her hair streaked with age, but her eyes are as sharp as a hawk god's. She tells you that she and her husband signed a contract, sure, but they also made their own rules. He agreed to do the morning baking if I fetched the water, she says. We made it work. You ask if it was love. She shrugs. At first maybe not, but he made me laugh. That was enough. That brings you to your historical fact. Although marriages could be arranged, many were based on mutual affection. Evidence from tomb inscriptions and love poetry suggests that people married those they genuinely cared for. Phrases like, "the one my heart desired," appear in funerary texts, alongside carvings of spouses holding hands or embracing in the afterlife. In death, as in life, being with your partner was a goal. Now here's your quirky fact for the day. Some marriage contracts included specific bedroom clauses. One fragment from the New Kingdom includes a promise that the husband will not deny her conjugal rights. Essentially, it's a written commitment to not neglect her sexually. If he does, she can bring it up in court. There are no records of how often that actually happened, but just the existence of that clause is wildly progressive. Ancient Egypt, where you could sue your husband for being a prude. Still, all this formality invites a question. Was marriage required for sex? Scholars debate this heavily. While marriage brought legal protections, especially for children and inheritance, it wasn't necessarily required for sexual relationships. People cohabited without formal contracts. Love poems often refer to secret trysts, hints of passion before marriage, or affairs that could have ended in scandal but often just fizzled into memory. Virginity wasn't obsessively policed, and sex wasn't viewed as shameful outside of marriage, unless it involved someone else's spouse. That, unsurprisingly, was a problem. As the sun climbs, you accompany a caravan delivering dowry goods to a merchant's daughter. It's not just furniture and jewellery, it's livestock, grain, tools, even a small portable shrine to keep in her new home. She's moving into her husband's house tomorrow, and while the mood is festive, there's an underlying seriousness. This isn't a wedding with flowers and flutes. This is a transfer of responsibility, status, and expectations. The bride smiles, but it's the kind of smile you wear when you're balancing excitement and terror. You help carry in a carved chest, and inside it, tucked between rolls of linen and beads, is a marriage contract sealed with wax. The bride's father shows it off proudly. We even included a clause about grain rations during the flood season, he says. Very smart girl. You're not sure whether to congratulate the couple or the lawyer. Later, sitting with a group of older women grinding barley, you ask them what makes a good marriage. One answers without pausing, respect, and separate blankets. Another cackles, and if he snores, go to the rooftop. Let the stars be your husband for the night. You laugh, but you're also quietly impressed. These women have worked out the art of love through repetition, compromise, and some occasional creative napping arrangements. By nightfall, the mood softens. Couples gather under the stars, some newly married, others 10 or 20 years into the thing. There's less passion in their touch, maybe, but more weight. The kind of intimacy that comes not from fireworks, but from shared harvests, lost children, inside jokes, and the ability to argue about bread without leaving the room. You watch one older man wrap a shawl around his wife's shoulders without a word. She leans into it like it's all the proof she's ever needed. In a culture where marriage was part love, part legal maneuver, part spiritual duty, it's clear that no two unions were exactly alike. But they all followed the same rhythm. Two people figuring it out under the same unrelenting sun, hoping for the occasional breeze, and maybe a clause or two to keep things fair. The first time you hear someone casually mention that Pharaoh married his sister, your brain does a double take. Like, wait, sorry, what now? You're half expecting a scandalous whisper or at least some mild social disapproval, but no. No one around you seems even remotely surprised. In fact, it's stated with the same tone you might use to describe what someone had for lunch. This is how you tumble into one of ancient Egypt's most eyebrow-raising realities. Royal incest was not just accepted, it was seen as ideal. To understand it, you first have to leave behind modern ethics and settle into the cosmic logic of the Egyptians. To them, Pharaoh wasn't just a ruler. He was a living god, a bridge between the divine and mortal realms, the earthly echo of Horus. His bloodline wasn't just sacred, it was literally divine, thought to trace back to the original gods themselves. And just like the gods, Osiris and Isis, Geb and Nut, Pharaoh had to preserve that celestial purity. The best way to do that? Marry within the family. Sister, half-sister, sometimes daughter. It wasn't seen as strange, it was sacred blood maintenance. You make your way to a temple relief depicting Akhenaten and Nefertiti. The two are drawn in the familiar Amarna style, elongated skulls, tender gestures, rays of the sun disk caressing their faces like warm fingers. They were husband and wife, yes, but also possibly cousins or half-siblings. It's hard to pin down exact family trees because the ancient royals treated lineage like a tangled papyrus scroll. Names repeating, mothers shifting, political marriages complicating everything. What's clear is that dynastic unions were engineered not for love but for symbolic continuity. If the gods kept it in the family, so would the king. And this wasn't limited to one or two weirdos. The great Ramses II married several of his daughters. The Ptolemies, Greek rulers who took up the pharaonic mantle much later, went hard on this trend, with Cleopatra herself being the product of brother-sister pairings, and then marrying her own younger brother, and later dumping him for Caesar, because options. You ask a temple scribe if people outside the royal court ever did this. He shakes his head. Number only the divine line. For the rest of us, marrying your sister would be like trying to plant barley in the same patch of earth every season. No growth, no strength. That comparison sticks with you. Elegant, agricultural, and blunt. Still, the royal exceptions can't help but feel extreme. You're told of one case where a king married his sister, then later married their daughter, then built temples showing all three in a sacred family triangle. Inscriptions speak of their beauty, their shared purpose, and their unity in divine function. The whole thing reads less like a family tree and more like a sacred circuit, energy flowing in a loop meant to sustain the world. Your historical fact: royal incest wasn't some shameful secret. It was public, inscribed on monuments, carved into tombs, and baked into court protocol. Titles like King's Sister and King's Daughter, Great Wife, weren't hidden. They were celebrated. These titles weren't just markers of kinship, but of power. Being both sister and wife made you untouchable by other nobles. You were elevated above them, forever within the tight circle of divine rulership. Now here's your quirky, slightly unhinged fact. Some royal women in the 18th dynasty took their titles to the next level by performing roles traditionally reserved for men. Hatshepsut, for example, styled herself King of Upper and Lower Egypt and wore the ceremonial false beard. Her bloodline was already pure, but by claiming male authority, she made herself the ultimate fusion of power, self-contained, self-ruling. Gender, in the royal context, bent around the preservation of control. But this all brings up a huge unresolved scholarly debate. Did the Egyptians understand the biological consequences of incest? Some scholars argue yes. Evidence from mummies shows deformities, congenital conditions, and signs of inbreeding. Others suggest that these were seen not as warnings but as signs of divine uniqueness. A clubfoot, a cleft palate, perhaps the mark of gods, not genetics. And remember, Egyptian medicine was advanced in some ways, but the idea of hereditary disease as we understand it didn't exist. What mattered was symbolism. What mattered was power. You visit a tomb and find a mural of a royal family seated together. Parents, children, spouses, all overlapping categories. There's nothing strange in the way. They're drawn. Their hands touch gently. Their faces turn toward one another. No visual cue says, "This is wrong." It just looks like unity, harmony, a closed loop. The family wasn't just a social structure. It was a sacred machine, constantly regenerating itself. Still, outside the palace, people gossiped. There are letters between nobles hinting at discomfort with certain pairings. "He is too close to her," one line reads. "Let the gods judge." You imagine quiet conversations behind closed doors, the awkward silences at court when Pharaoh introduced his new wife, who also happened to be his niece. But no one challenged it outright. To question the pharaoh's marriage was to question the gods. You return to the village where a young couple is preparing to move in together. They're cousins, but from opposite sides of the family, and you ask the older aunt if that's unusual. "Not at all," she says, "but a sister? Number that's for kings." Then she spits twice, as if to ward off any such suggestion. By sunset, you find yourself back at the river, watching as young women wash linens and splash one another with water. A boy leans against a tree nearby, trying to look disinterested and failing. It's all innocent, natural, human. Desire here flows easily, but it follows rules. Lines exist, and while royalty may draw those lines in golden ink and sweep them into loops of divine self-reference, everyone else prefers a little distance between branches on the family tree. So yes, the pharaoh could, and did, marry his sister. But that wasn't the norm. That was the burden of being divine, of walking among mortals while still playing by the rules of myth. And sometimes, to keep the gods alive in your blood, you had to do things that made mortals cringe, especially the modern ones. It's late afternoon, and you're standing in a modest artisan's home tucked behind the bustling edge of the temple quarter. Light streams through a reed window, casting golden bands across the walls, and your eyes drift to a low table carved with vines and papyrus blooms. But what really grabs your attention is what's painted beneath it. Two figures, entwined in a very unmistakable pose, rendered with such casual grace that it takes a second for your brain to catch up. This isn't just decoration, this is erotica. And now you're about to dive headfirst into the deliciously awkward but wildly fascinating topic of ancient Egyptian sex positions. Or, as modern scholars awkwardly phrase it, intimate iconography. Let's start with the obvious. sex in ancient Egypt was not shrouded in shame. It was part of life, part of art, and sometimes part of the furniture. Erotic depictions were tucked into household objects, sketched onto pottery shards, even carved onto the undersides of beds and stools. Not because people were pervy or crude, but because sex was part of the cycle of joy and survival. You had crops, beer, a roof over your head, and, ideally, a warm body to share it all with. Why not celebrate it with a tasteful, or not so tasteful little doodle? You're shown a painted ostrakon, a piece of limestone once used like a notepad by scribes, where someone sketched what can only be described as a very flexible couple mid-action. It's drawn quickly, almost playfully, but with surprising anatomical accuracy. The man wears a crown, maybe meant to mock royalty, and the woman holds a lotus. No text accompanies it, but the message is pretty clear. This wasn't intended for a tomb wall, it was likely a private joke or personal fantasy, a very ancient, very X-rated post-it note. Now, before we go any further, let's clear up a myth. There is no known Kama Sutra of the Nile. No formal guidebook, no sacred text listing 1001 positions in pleasing hieroglyphic order. What we do have are fragments, images, graffiti, suggestive poetry that give us clues about what people liked, what they joked about, and how they represented intimacy in art. And while most of this material is fairly tame, there's one wild exception, the Turin erotic papyrus. Yes, it has a name, and no, it is not safe for work. Housed today in a museum in Italy, this papyrus is often referred to as the world's oldest known piece of pornographic art. It's a long scroll showing a series of acrobatic sexual encounters between a balding, pot-bellied man and a lithe young woman. Each scene is detailed, explicit, and, according to some scholars, hilarious. The man's exaggerated features suggest he may be a parody of someone specific, possibly a disgraced official or just a satirical character meant to entertain. The woman remains calm, collected, almost smug in every scene, as if she's the one in charge, which she probably is. You sit with a local artist who's seen copies of the Turin Papyrus and ask her opinion. She rolls her eyes. "It's a joke," she says. "No one actually does that." Then she pauses. "Well, maybe that one, but not the goat part." You decide not to follow up on that. So what positions were typical? Based on art and texts, the most commonly depicted ones are familiar: missionary, seated face to face, or from behind. Some poetry hints at outdoor encounters, beneath the sycamore, suggesting spontaneity and natural surroundings. Others speak of lifting the skirt, or embracing from behind as the barley sways, which is either a beautiful metaphor or a very sensual description of agriculture. Your historical fact today is that erotic scenes were not just reserved for hidden corners. In Deir el-Medina, the village of tomb builders, walls have been found with murals showing gods and mortals engaging in suggestive acts, often with symbolic undertones. These weren't necessarily pornographic in intent, but celebratory, humorous, or even magical. In one tomb, a carving shows a couple in a loving embrace, with a caption that loosely translates to, "He pleases her like the flood pleases the land." It's the most wholesome metaphor for foreplay you've ever heard. Now for the fringe fact, some fertility rituals, especially those conducted in private homes or rural shrines, may have included symbolic sexual postures performed in front of figurines or fertility icons. These weren't necessarily real acts, but gestural invocations, kneeling, presenting, mimicking union to encourage conception. A form of ritual intimacy meant to sync the body with the will of the gods. Whether people took that idea further is anyone's guess, but you do find a figurine shaped like a woman arching backward with arms spread. You ask the shopkeeper what it's for, she winks. For balance and babies. The scholarly debate here centres on interpretation. Is erotic art meant to be literal or symbolic? Were these images meant as instructional, satirical, devotional, or purely decorative? Some say the Turin Papyrus is political satire hidden under erotic frosting. Others think it was just dirty fun, ancient smut for smut's sake. And the line between sacred and profane, as always in Egypt, is beautifully blurred. A scene that looks obscene might actually be a fertility blessing, or a political jab, or both. As the sun drops lower and the city cools, you walk past a courtyard where a young couple flirts over a shared bowl of figs. He drops one, she catches it mid-air, and they both laugh. There's a rhythm between them. Teasing, knowing, effortless. You see the way she leans in, the way he shifts closer, and you realise they don't need a papyrus scroll or carved diagram. They already know the choreography. It's the oldest one in the world. By nightfall, you return to your borrowed room and notice that the legs of the wooden bed are shaped like lion paws. Decorative, sure, but maybe also symbolic. Strength, virility, and the fierce passion of Sekhmet, lion-headed goddess of war, and, incidentally, some very intense love poetry. You lie down, staring at the reed ceiling, and wonder how many couples have whispered under these same stars, hearts racing, limbs tangled, no guidebook required. In ancient Egypt, there were no rules carved in stone about how to love or how to touch, just instincts, images, and a cultural belief that pleasure wasn't something to hide. It was something to honour, preferably while balancing on one leg and holding a lotus flower, if the Turin papyrus is to be believed. The midday sun pounds down relentlessly, and you find yourself ducking into the cool shade of a bustling market stall where bundles of herbs and jars of sticky substances promise relief and other things. Today, you're about to uncover the strange, surprisingly pragmatic, and yes, sometimes downright gross, ways the ancient Egyptians handled birth control. Because for all their poetic love songs and sacred rituals, these people knew that sometimes avoiding an extra mouth to feed was just as important as celebrating fertility. You lean over a collection of oddly shaped vessels and dried plants, as the vendor, an older woman with a sly smile and fingers stained from grinding ingredients, explains the most common methods. Honey, she says, is a base, sticky, sweet, and strong. You nod, vaguely recalling that honey has antibacterial properties. But here it's not just for healing cuts. It's an ingredient in contraceptives, applied carefully to block or kill sperm. She reaches behind the counter and pulls out a small, oddly shaped ceramic pessary, coated in resin and herbs. This was one of the birth control devices of the day, inserted like a modern diaphragm to physically block conception. The resin was thought to also kill sperm, acting as an early spermicide. You watch as she mixes a paste of acacia gum, dates, and a pinch of crushed crocodile dung. Yes, crocodile dung, explaining that the dung acted as a potent irritant to discourage sperm. Your stomach does a nervous flip. It's wild, but you remind yourself that the Nile and its creatures permeated every aspect of life, from diet to medicine to magic. People believed that the crocodile's fierce nature could be harnessed to prevent pregnancy. You're not sure if this method was popular or just desperate, but it's definitely memorable. Another recipe includes a blend of wild lettuce and galbanum, steeped in wine and honey, drunk daily to reduce fertility. There are also magical spells, inscribed on papyrus or amulets, intended to protect women from unwanted pregnancy. One such charm invokes Bes, the dwarf god of fertility and childbirth, asking him to close the womb or turn away the seed. The mix of practical and mystical in these approaches is fascinating. Here's your historical fact. Ancient Egyptian medical texts like the Khun Gynecological Papyrus, around 1800 BCE, include detailed descriptions of contraceptive recipes and fertility tests. Women were treated as active participants in reproductive health, seeking both herbal remedies and magical protections. This is among the earliest known evidence of birth control in human history. But of course, there's the fringe angle too. Some later sources, Greek and Roman, describe Egyptian women using crocodile dung pessaries and credit them with pioneering ancient safe sex. Modern scholars, however, debate the efficacy and safety of such methods. Were they widespread or rare? Useful or dangerous? The crocodile dung probably caused irritation, which could prevent conception but might also cause infections. The truth is probably somewhere in between. Then there's the open debate. How did the Egyptians view fertility control ethically? Fertility was deeply connected to the gods and the continuation of family lines. Was using contraception seen as defying divine will? Or was it simply another tool, part of the natural cycle of life? Some Egyptologists argue that birth control was accepted pragmatically, especially among the working classes who needed to space children due to economic realities. Others suggest that magical spells for contraception imply some ambivalence, maybe a tension between desire and duty. You're handed a small amulet shaped like a lotus bud, thought to symbolize rebirth but also fertility, and told that women wore these to regulate their cycles or protect against pregnancy. It's delicate, smooth, and surprisingly heavy in your hand. You imagine women slipping these under their tunics, a secret talisman between power and privacy. As you walk along the riverbank later, you see a mother soothing her infant with date wine, while her daughter quietly mumbles a charm to turn away the seed. The cycle continues, always balancing between life and restraint, desire and responsibility. It's a reminder that even in a world where sex was sacred, it was also practical. The Egyptians understood that love and fertility were gifts, but sometimes you just needed a little control. Honey, crocodile dung, and a prayer to Bez, ancient birth control, Nile style. Even in a society as open about sexuality as ancient Egypt, infidelity was a problem, and not just a quiet one. You're quickly learning that cheating, suspicion, and jealousy stirred plenty of drama, and sometimes the fallout involved curses that would make your hair stand on end. Welcome to the scandalous underbelly of ancient love, when love turns sour and magic takes the stage. You stroll through a modest home where a middle-aged woman is carefully arranging small figurines of Bez, the protective god of households and sexuality. Bes wasn't just about joy. He was also a guardian against evil forces, including jealous rivals and adulterous partners. The woman tells you that when she suspected her husband of straying, she placed these statues strategically around the house. They watch, she says with a knowing smile, and if he betrays me, they will make sure he regrets it. This isn't superstition alone. Curses were a real weapon. In papyri from the period you find texts that look like breakup letters gone terribly wrong. Spell after spell invoking harm on a cheating spouse. Some curses ask for blindness, illness, or even death to fall upon the adulterer. Others demand humiliation or the loss of fertility. The belief was simple. Magic could enforce loyalty where words failed. You find one such curse, scratched into a piece of pottery, probably by an angry lover. May the serpent strike your loins, and may your seed dry like the desert sand. The language is poetic, brutal, and full of raw emotion, and it's just one of many. Historically, adultery was taken seriously. Women caught cheating could be divorced or worse, and men were expected to provide heirs, not entertain outside lovers. Yet, texts also reveal that infidelity wasn't uncommon. Some letters suggest secret trysts and double lives, while love poems sometimes hint at longing for a forbidden partner. The tension between desire and social order was very real. Your quirky fact: one love spell intended to attract a lover involves mixing menstrual blood, beer, and parts of a dead mouse, then burning the concoction while reciting incantations. Yeah, it's gross, but it shows how far people were willing to go for passion and revenge. Magic wasn't just for gods, it was for heartbreak and petty grudges too. Scholars debate whether these curses were mostly symbolic or actually believed to be effective. Some argue that curses functioned as social pressure, a way to police morality in tight-knit communities. Others think that the fear of magic was so real that people genuinely avoided betrayal out of terror of spiritual consequences. Either way, the magic wasn't just entertainment, it was a force woven into daily life. You watch as a woman prepares a curse scroll, carefully inscribing hieroglyphs and sealing it with wax. She whispers names and deeds, invoking the goddess Sekhmet to unleash her fury. The scroll is then hidden beneath a threshold, or tossed into the Nile, sending the curse into the world. The act is part justice, part prayer, and part desperate hope. Later, you hear about love potions brewed to make someone faithful, or at least docile. These often included strong herbs like henbane or mandrake, both psychoactive and potentially dangerous. Sometimes the potions were as much about control as affection, blurring lines between love and manipulation. Back in the village, gossip travels fast. You overhear a conversation about a man caught sneaking away with a temple dancer. The wife's response? She sent a cursed scroll, some nasty herbs, and a stern letter to his family. The scandal spreads like wildfire, reminding everyone that loyalty was enforced in more ways than one. You begin to see that in ancient Egypt, love and sex came with real risks. Jealousy wasn't just emotional, it was magical and sometimes lethal. Relationships were as much about managing power as about passion, and when that balance tipped, curses were waiting. As twilight falls, you ponder the fierce intertwining of love, lust, and retribution. Desire could spark joy or ignite rage, and the Egyptians embraced both with equal intensity. After all, passion without consequences isn't really passion at all. You wake up to the distant crow of a rooster and the soft rustle of palm leaves swaying in the morning breeze. Today, your footsteps lead you not to the marketplace or the temple, but to a small, tucked-away shrine dedicated to fertility. It's one of those places where hope and desperation mingle like incense smoke, and where couples come seeking help when their dreams of children have stalled. Because in ancient Egypt, fertility wasn't just biology. It was a sacred dance involving magic, medicine, and statues that might look like toys but were anything but. You enter the shrine, where the air is thick with the scent of myrrh and the soft murmur of prayers. The walls are lined with small figurines, known as fertility dolls, or concubines, carved from clay or ivory. These little effigies, often depicting naked women with exaggerated hips and breasts, were believed to embody the essence of fertility and could be used in rituals to encourage conception. Couples would leave offerings here, hoping the figurines might intercede on their behalf with the gods. One elderly priestess explains that couples often brought these figures home, keeping them by their beds or near their hearths, and sometimes gently rubbing them as part of a nightly ritual. It wasn't just superstition, it was a way to channel hope, to focus desire and intention. The figurines were not mere decorations, they were spiritual tools imbued with power. You're shown a particularly fine example. A small statuette of a seated woman, her belly rounded, eyes closed in bliss. It's believed that touching her hips while reciting a special chant could help loosen any blockages preventing conception. The priestess whispers the chant for you, a soft, rhythmic invocation to Hathor and Min, the divine duo of love and fertility. Your historical fact: the Kahun gynecological papyrus, dating from around 1800 BCE, includes spells, herbal remedies, and diagnostic tests for fertility problems. It describes various treatments, from herbal potions to magical rituals, reflecting a sophisticated, if not entirely modern, approach to reproductive health. Fertility wasn't left to chance. It was actively managed with a blend of science and spirituality. The priestess also tells you about the birth bricks, flat clay slabs sometimes used during labour. Women would squat on these bricks, which were decorated with images of Hathor and other protective deities. The bricks were thought to ease childbirth, both physically and spiritually. There's even a story of a royal mother who refused to give birth without her birth brick by her side, trusting the goddess's protection through every contraction. Here's your quirky fact. Some fertility rituals involved offering parts of animals, like the legs of a freshly slaughtered goat, or even sacred cakes baked with special ingredients. These cakes were sometimes shaped like animals or phalluses, symbolizing vitality and abundance. Imagine the smell of baking mingling with incense and prayers, turning the kitchen into a mini fertility temple. Now for the scholarly debate. How much of ancient Egyptian fertility practice was based on empirical observation, and how much was purely magical thinking? Some scholars argue that many herbal remedies mentioned in papyri have real medicinal properties, such as uterine stimulants or anti-inflammatory effects. Others suggest that the magical rituals served primarily psychological and social functions, helping couples cope with anxiety and maintain hope. It's likely both were true, intertwined into a seamless blend. Outside the shrine, you see a young couple offering fresh lotus blossoms, their faces full of hopeful expectation. The lotus, symbol of rebirth and purity, was also linked to sexual vitality. The woman carries a small amulet in the shape of a seed pod, and you know she wears it as a talisman against infertility. As you leave, you pass a small altar to Bez, whose protective, mischievous presence is invoked to guard pregnancies and newborns alike. The god's image is everywhere, a reminder that fertility was a divine blessing, fiercely guarded and celebrated. Back in the village, children play near the Nile's edge, their laughter a living testament to the success of countless fertility hopes. You realise that for the ancient Egyptians, fertility wasn't just a personal matter, it was a communal celebration, a sacred trust passed from generation to generation, embodied in clay, prayer, and the endless cycle of the river itself. As the sun climbs toward its zenith, you find yourself weaving through the crowded streets of a bustling city, the air alive with the calls of merchants and the laughter of children, But your path today leads you not to the marketplaces or temples, but into a world both shadowed and luminous, the lives of courtesans in ancient Egypt. These women, often overshadowed in history by queens and priestesses, occupied a complex space where sensuality, survival, and political influence intertwined like the braided hair that adorned their heads. You enter a modest but well-appointed home near the city's centre, where a middle-aged woman named Merit lives. She's dressed in fine linen, her eyes rimmed with kohl that highlights their sharp intelligence and warm humour. Merit explains that courtesans were not just entertainers, they were companions, advisors, and sometimes power brokers. "We know how to please," she says, her voice both playful and serious, "but we also know how to listen." Courtesans often worked in the households of the elite, attending banquets, performing music and dance, and providing companionship. Unlike common prostitutes, who were marginalised, courtesans could enjoy a degree of respect and security, especially if they cultivated relationships with powerful men. Their influence could extend beyond the bedroom into political realms, shaping decisions and alliances. Merit gestures toward a delicate amulet hanging from her neck, a symbol of Hathor, goddess of love and music. "Hathor watches over us," she says. "She gives us strength." Your historical fact, evidence from tomb inscriptions and papyrus, shows that courtesans could own property, receive wages, and even have legal standing in certain cases. They were skilled in arts like singing, dancing, and poetry, which enhanced their social value. Some, like the famous royal mistress T, wielded significant political clout, advising pharaohs and influencing court life. But life wasn't all luxury. Courtesans had to navigate complex social dynamics, balancing favour with vulnerability. Competition was fierce, and falling out of favour could mean poverty or worse. Many courtesans belonged to guilds or communities that offered some protection, and rituals invoking Bez or Hathor were common for warding off harm and attracting clients. Now, for your quirky fact, some courtesans were also known for their distinctive beauty routines, involving elaborate wigs scented with exotic oils and intricate tattoos of protective symbols. Tattoos of the god Bez, for example, were popular for their believed powers to protect and enhance fertility. Imagine a body art salon in the bustling streets of Thebes, where stylists etch tiny divine faces onto willing skin. Scholars debate the precise role of courtesans in Egyptian society. Some argue they were marginalised figures, exploited and confined to the fringes. Others contend they were empowered women who used their talents and intelligence to carve out independent lives, influencing culture and politics in subtle but significant ways. The truth likely spans a wide spectrum, varying by time, place, and individual circumstance. In the evening, you attend a feast where musicians play lyres and flutes, and dancers whirl in vivid skirts. Merit moves through the crowd with graceful confidence, her laughter ringing clear. You see how courtesans could illuminate even the darkest corners of a world bound by rigid hierarchies, reminding everyone that desire and intellect often walked hand in hand. As night settles, you watch a pair of courtesans exchanging whispered advice on courting a particularly influential nobleman. Their eyes gleam with cunning and camaraderie. In their world, survival was art, and love was both a weapon and a sanctuary. You realise that the story of ancient Egyptian sexuality is incomplete without their voices, women who loved, laughed, and ruled from the shadows. The morning sun filters gently through the papyrus curtains as you enter a modest home where a remarkable woman named Ankerson resides. She isn't a courtesan or a queen, but a housewife, a title that might make you think of quiet domesticity, but in ancient Egypt carried a surprising amount of agency. Today, you're about to uncover the subtle power that some women held within their households, wielded not with swords or scrolls, but with quiet confidence, savvy management, and, yes, a fair bit of charm. Ankerson's home smells faintly of freshly baked bread and crushed coriander. She's busy arranging linen and organising storage jars, but when you ask about her role in the family, her eyes brighten. "I manage the estate," she says simply. "I control the servants, oversee the grain stores, and make decisions when my husband is away." This isn't a small responsibility. In a culture where property and wealth were vital to survival, a woman who could keep the household running smoothly wielded significant power. You learn that Egyptian women could own property outright, inherit from their parents, and enter contracts independently. Marriage didn't erase these rights. In fact, in many cases, a wife managed the household economy, negotiated dowries, and even supervised agricultural production. Ankerson shows you a document where she has authorised the sale of a plot of land, her signature clear and confident. Historical fact: legal documents from ancient Egypt reveal that women had an unusual degree of legal and economic autonomy for the time. Some wives, particularly those in wealthier families, served as de facto managers and financiers. This autonomy wasn't universal, but it was recognised and respected in law. Here's a quirky detail. Many women use beauty and charm not just for personal allure but as tools of influence within their families and communities. Perfumes, elaborate wigs, and carefully applied kohl could signal social status and command respect. Some women even kept a stash of love spells or charms, not for wild passion, but to maintain harmony with their husbands. Think of it as relationship maintenance with a magical twist. Scholars debate how widespread this female agency truly was. Some argue that powerful women were exceptions, outliers who thrived because of wealth or special circumstances. Others believe that legal rights and social norms gave most women a surprising level of influence behind the scenes, especially in managing day-to-day affairs. The truth probably depends on class, region, and individual personality. You sit with Ankerson as she teaches her daughter the art of negotiation, how to secure better prices at the market, how to navigate social expectations, and how to balance kindness with firmness. A woman who knows her worth is a woman who is never ignored, she says. It's advice as relevant now as it was then. As evening falls, you watch Ankerson settle disputes among servants and advise her husband on business deals. Her presence is calm but unmistakably powerful. She is the heart of the household, the keeper of peace, and the quiet force behind her family's success. In a culture that celebrated gods and kings, you realise that everyday power often lived in the hands of women like Ankerson, women who shaped the world not with grand gestures, but with steady, skilled care. Their stories may not be carved in stone or sung in temples, but they are just as vital to the tapestry of ancient Egyptian life. The sun is setting low over the Nile, casting a warm amber glow that softens the edges of the bustling city. You wander into a quiet courtyard where the walls are adorned with intricate paintings, scenes of banquets, festivals, and notably erotic art. Ancient Egyptian culture didn't shy away from the erotic. It embroidered it into its everyday visual language, transforming desire into poetry, humour, and spiritual symbolism. Tonight, you'll trace how the erotic pulsed through art and literature, from cheeky sketches to carefully composed love songs. First, you come across a series of ostraca, pottery shards doodled on by workers and scribes in their downtime. These often feature crude, playful images of couples in humorous or risque situations. One shows a man chasing a woman who's holding a basket on her head, her skirt teasingly lifted just enough to reveal a glimpse of thigh. Another depicts two figures engaged in a dance that's half flirtation, half fondling. These scribbles weren't meant for the temple. They were informal, intimate glimpses into everyday desires and fantasies, perhaps even ancient Egyptian dirty jokes. You move on to love poetry, some of the oldest in the world. Written mostly during the New Kingdom, these poems aren't shy about longing, passion, and playful seduction. They evoke vivid sensory details, warm breath, trembling hands, the scent of lotus flowers, and express mutual desire with striking honesty. One verse reads, "Your lips drip honey, your touch is the flood that fills my heart." It's a line that's both tender and intoxicating, capturing the sweet ache of yearning. The erotic also finds a place in more formal art. Tomb paintings often depict couples holding hands, embracing, or in affectionate poses that symbolize unity in life and afterlife. These images aren't pornographic. They're celebrations of love's power to transcend death. Holding hands in the afterlife meant eternal companionship, a comfort for the deceased, and a wish for the living. A historical fact: the tale of the shipwrecked sailor, an ancient narrative, includes references to romantic encounters and flirtations, revealing that even adventure stories embrace sexuality as part of the human experience. Eroticism was woven into every genre, from poetry to myth to everyday graffiti. For a quirky twist, consider the love stelae found across Egypt. Small stone monuments erected by lovers who inscribed their declarations and promises. One such stele, discovered near Luxor, features a man proclaiming his undying devotion, promising to hold your hand as the lotus holds the water. It's a bit like an ancient Instagram love post, carved in stone and meant to last for eternity. The scholarly debate here revolves around interpretation. Were erotic images primarily religious, symbolic, or personal? Some scholars argue that depictions of sexual acts in art had magical or protective purposes, to ensure fertility or ward off evil. Others believe many of these were just everyday expressions of human intimacy, meant to be enjoyed rather than decoded. The line between the sacred and the profane was, as usual, wonderfully blurry. As twilight deepens, you overhear a group of young women reciting love poems under the stars, their voices soft but full of passion. You realise that in ancient Egypt, eroticism was never just physical. It was a language, a performance, a vital part of how people connected with one another and the divine. You leave the courtyard feeling a little lighter, a little more connected to a world where love and desire weren't whispered about but sung, painted, and lived openly. Here, the erotic was not shameful. It was beautiful, necessary, and utterly human. You step quietly into a shadowed tomb chamber, where the air is cool and heavy with the scent of ancient oils and dust. Here, amidst the solemn reliefs and hieroglyphs, you find something unexpected. Hints, sometimes subtle, sometimes bold, of same-sex love and companionship. Ancient Egypt wasn't silent on this topic. Rather, it wove it into myth, legend, and everyday life in ways that still puzzle and fascinate scholars today. Tonight, you're exploring homosexuality in Egypt, a subject wrapped in mystery, nuance, and debate. Your first stop is the tale of Niankhkhnum and Khnumhotep, two royal manicurists buried together in the 5th dynasty. Their tomb is unique. Their names are paired side by side, and the wall paintings depict them embracing, holding hands and touching noses, gestures traditionally associated with married couples. Scholars argue fiercely about the nature of their relationship. Were they brothers, lifelong friends, or a romantic couple? The tenderness in their portrayal is undeniable, but the cultural context complicates interpretation. Ancient Egyptians had a different way of expressing intimacy, one that didn't always map neatly onto modern categories. Further evidence emerges from the myths of gods who sometimes assumed multiple genders or fluid forms. The deity Hapi, associated with fertility, and the Nile's inundation, was often depicted as androgynous, blurring lines between male and female. Similarly, the concept of two souls in one body, or K, suggested that identity was flexible, opening room for diverse expressions of love and desire. You learn that male homoeroticism was sometimes acknowledged without scandal, especially in artistic and literary contexts. Poetic inscriptions from tombs hinted affection between men, while some scribes' graffiti playfully references same-sex attraction. Female homosexuality is harder to trace, largely due to societal structures emphasizing heterosexual reproduction, but some scholars believe references exist in less overt ways, through poetry, dance, and ritual. Your historical fact, the story of Horus and Seth, includes episodes where gender and sexual identity blur, with Seth sometimes depicted in feminine roles or engaging in acts challenging traditional masculinity. These stories weren't simply entertainment. They engaged with concepts of power, chaos, and order through fluid expressions of gender and sexuality. For a quirky fringe fact, some fringe Egyptologists speculate that certain priestly roles involved ritualized same-sex relationships, particularly in fertility rites or temple ceremonies, though this remains highly contested. The evidence is tantalizing but fragmentary, often relying on ambiguous texts or iconography. The major scholarly debate centers on interpretation. Was same-sex love accepted, tolerated, or stigmatized? Some scholars argue that while such relationships existed and were sometimes publicly acknowledged, they did not fit into a modern concept of sexual orientation. Others suggest that ancient Egypt was relatively permissive compared to other ancient societies, with love and desire seen more fluidly. You sit in the dim light of the tomb, tracing the carved hands of Niankhkhnum and Khnumhotep. The intimacy between them transcends time, inviting you to rethink what love looked like in a world so different, yet so familiar. You realize that in ancient Egypt, love, whether between men, women or gods, was part of the great, messy, beautiful tapestry of life. Outside, the desert wind whispers, and you wonder what secrets those sun-baked stones will reveal next. The soft glow of twilight filters through the reeds as you find yourself wandering near a funerary complex where the living and the dead are intimately entwined. In ancient Egypt, the afterlife was more than a shadowy realm. It was a vibrant continuation of earthly existence. And yes, that included love, companionship, and the pleasures of the flesh. You're about to discover why couples were often buried together, and how sex was envisioned as part of eternity itself. At the heart of this belief is the idea that death was not an end but a passage. The tomb was a home for the soul, K, and the spirit, Ba, and for these to thrive they needed familiar comforts: food, drink, music, and crucially companionship. Couples were often depicted holding hands, embracing or sharing intimate moments in tomb paintings, symbols of their eternal bond. You look at a fresco of a husband and wife seated side by side, their hands gently intertwined, eyes calm and assured. It's a tender promise. In death, as in life, they remain united. One particularly famous example is the Tomb of Mechatri, where miniature wooden models depict scenes of daily life, including couples at rest and playful children. These miniatures were meant to serve the deceased in the afterlife, ensuring that the pleasures of life would continue beyond the grave. It's as if the Egyptians imagined the afterlife as a continuation of the joys they cherished: love, laughter, and yes, intimacy. Here's your historical fact. Couples were sometimes buried in shared tombs, or at least in adjacent ones, emphasizing the importance of their relationship for the journey beyond. Funerary texts include spells and instructions designed to reunite lovers and keep their passions alive in the next world. Sex wasn't taboo in death. It was sacred. You also encounter the notion that the pharaoh, as divine ruler, was expected to continue his role in the afterlife, including conjugal duties with his queen. The divine union was central to maintaining cosmic order, Mat, and so love and sex had cosmic, eternal significance. Now, for a quirky fringe fact. Some tombs contain inscriptions or images that may hint at erotic acts performed by the deceased or gods in the afterlife, explicit scenes that, while rare, suggest that Egyptians imagined an active, pleasurable afterlife. These depictions challenge modern sensibilities about death and sexuality, showing a culture comfortable with the idea of physical delight beyond the grave. The scholarly debate revolves around interpretation. Were these images symbolic representations of fertility and regeneration, or were they meant literally? Did Egyptians believe in a physical afterlife where sex was part of daily routine, or was it a metaphor for spiritual unity? Egyptologists continue to puzzle over these questions, with evidence supporting both views. As night falls, you stand beneath a star-studded sky, thinking about the eternal dance of life and death. For the ancient Egyptians, love didn't stop at the riverbank. It flowed with the Nile itself into infinity. And maybe, just maybe, the lovers buried side by side are still holding hands somewhere in the soft shadows beyond. You're wandering through the bustling morning market, the aroma of spices and fresh bread swirling through the air, when a curious motif catches your eye. Frogs, snakes and geese, painted on pottery, carved into amulets and woven into textiles. At first glance, these animals seem random, but soon you realise they're rich with sexual symbolism, innuendo and coded meaning in ancient Egypt's vibrant culture. Tonight, you'll dive into the wild world of animal symbolism and what it really meant for desire and sex. Let's start with frogs. They were everywhere, jumping along riverbanks, croaking in marshes and appearing in spells. Frogs symbolised fertility, rebirth and transformation because of their explosive emergence during the Nile flood season. But they also had a cheekier reputation. Some hieroglyphs showed frogs with exaggerated features linked to male virility. The croak? Ancient Egyptians believed it mimicked the sounds of lovemaking. You chuckle, imagining frogs as nature's original Casanovas. Snakes, on the other hand, were complex symbols, sometimes feared, sometimes revered. The cobra, or uraeus, adorned pharaohs' crowns, signifying divine authority and protection. But snakes also represented sexuality, especially male potency, because of their shape and movements. There were even fertility spells invoking snake deities, meant to ignite the fires of passion and bring forth new life. You spot a tiny snake amulet, carried by lovers hoping to enhance desire and guard against jealousy. Geese might seem an odd addition, but in Egyptian mythology, they had a reputation for, well, enthusiastic mating habits. The laughing goose was often used in jokes and erotic poetry, sometimes as a metaphor for promiscuity or flirtation. Lovers compared themselves to geese, noting their noisy displays and frequent couplings. You imagine goose-themed Valentine's Day cards, if only they had papyrus and ink. Your historical fact: animal symbolism was deeply embedded in Egyptian religion and daily life. Gods often took animal forms or combined human and animal traits to embody sexual and creative power. For instance, Min, the god of fertility, was often depicted alongside lettuce and snakes, both symbols of virility. Now, here's your quirky fact. Some small statues or amulets depicted animals with exaggerated sexual features, not for shock value but as charms to promote fertility or protect the wearer's sexual vitality. Some were even worn as talismans to boost performance or ensure conception. One pharaoh reportedly kept a collection of such charms in his personal treasury. The scholarly debate revolves around interpretation again. Were these animal symbols purely religious, or were they part of everyday sexual humour and innuendo? Some Egyptologists argue that sexual double entendre were common, blending sacred and profane language. Others see the symbolism as strictly ritualistic, part of a divine language inaccessible to the layperson. The truth probably falls somewhere in the lively intersection. As the market buzzes around you, you see a pair of lovers sharing a secret smile over a basket of figs, their fingers entwined like the serpents on a pharaoh's crown. In this world, the line between nature, divinity, and desire is as fluid as the ever-flowing Nile itself. You're wandering down a dusty alleyway when your eye catches something unexpected. A shard of pottery, half buried in sand, covered in crude sketches and scribbled words. Welcome to the ancient world's equivalent of graffiti, the raw, unfiltered voice of everyday Egyptians. And guess what? It's filthy, funny, and shockingly revealing about their sexual fantasies and humour. Tonight you're delving into the world of dirty jokes on pottery shards, because even 3,000 years ago, people loved a good, and sometimes inappropriate, laugh. The shard you hold features a caricature of a man with an exaggerated phallus, chasing a woman who's giggling while holding a basket above her head, an image reminiscent of some of the more playful ostraka found in the workers' village at Deir el Medina. Beneath the drawing, a scrawled caption roughly translates to, "Catch me if you can, or you'll get more than figs." You can't help but grin. These weren't commissioned masterpieces, but the offhand scribbles of bored labourers or cheeky scribes letting off steam. Such graffiti was surprisingly common. Walls in workers' quarters, taverns, and even near temples bore erotic images and bawdy jokes. Sometimes they served as light-hearted relief. Other times, they were outright sexual satire aimed at figures of authority or neighbours. They reveal a world where humour and sexuality coexisted comfortably and publicly, much more openly than we often assume about the ancient past. Historical fact: many ostraka, pieces of broken pottery or limestone, from the New Kingdom include explicit sketches and humorous commentary, often reflecting the daily lives and private thoughts of craftsmen and scribes. These provide invaluable insight into popular culture, far from the formal tomb inscriptions and temple reliefs. Here's a quirky fact for you. Some graffiti featured animals in sexual scenarios, like geese mounting each other or monkeys engaged in various antics, which were both humorous and symbolic. Monkeys were especially popular as subjects of ribald humour, probably because of their human-like behaviour. It's ancient Egyptian stand-up comedy in visual form. Scholars debate the social function of this graffiti. Were these private jokes meant to bond communities, or were they a form of subtle rebellion against the strict moral codes of temple and palace? Some see the graffiti as evidence that Egyptian society was more sexually relaxed and playful than the grandiose formal records suggest. Others caution that such humour was likely confined to specific groups and places, not reflecting elite attitudes. You find a group of young workers nearby, laughing as they trade whispered jokes and mimic the poses seen on the shards. Their camaraderie, punctuated by these risque sketches, feels timeless. just like a late-night dorm room filled with graffiti and laughter, connecting you to a shared human experience across millennia. As you pocket the shard for safekeeping, you reflect on how humour, sexuality, and art have always been intertwined. Sometimes, the most honest glimpses into a culture come not from statues or scrolls, but from the cheeky scribbles left behind by everyday people daring to be themselves. You might think that with all the emphasis on fertility, pleasure, and divine sexuality, celibacy would have its place. But in ancient Egypt, abstinence was, well, pretty much a no-go. The culture was all about more love, more life, more offspring, and very little about less. Tonight, you're going to explore why celibacy was rare and generally not celebrated, and what that says about Egyptian attitudes towards sex and social order. You find yourself sitting with a group of temple workers near the Great Temple of Karnak, chatting about rituals and daily life. When you ask about priests and celibacy, they look surprised. Celibacy, one man says, stroking his beard. Why would anyone want that? The gods made us to live and love. The pharaoh has many wives. Why should the servants of the gods be any different? In fact, many priests were married, had children, and lived ordinary family lives. Sexual abstinence was mostly reserved for very specific ritual contexts or mourning periods, not a permanent state. In contrast to the celibate priesthoods of later religions, Egyptian priests often saw sexuality as part of their sacred duties. Some temple rituals celebrated fertility openly, involving singing, dancing, and sometimes even sexual acts meant to invoke divine blessings. Celibacy was sometimes practiced briefly, especially before important rituals, but long-term abstinence was considered unnatural and even harmful to one's spiritual health. Your historical fact: in the Temple of Hathor at Dendera, festivals included public celebrations of sexuality, music, and dance. Priests and priestesses participated fully in these festivities, reinforcing the idea that sexual vitality was linked to spiritual vitality. It was a celebration of life, not denial. Here's a quirky detail. Some priests reportedly wore symbols of fertility, such as phallic amulets, to embody the generative powers they invoked during ceremonies. These weren't hidden. They were proud declarations of their role as facilitators of cosmic creation. Imagine walking into a temple and spotting a priest sporting a charm you wouldn't expect at your local church. Scholars debate the nuances of priestly celibacy. Some argue that certain higher-ranking priests may have abstained for ritual purity, while others contend that most priests maintained active family lives. The evidence is patchy, but overall, celibacy was certainly not a widespread ideal. Instead, sexuality was embraced as a necessary, joyous aspect of human and divine existence. You notice that even the funerary texts emphasize sexual renewal. The deceased were expected to enjoy pleasures, including sexual ones, in the afterlife. Celibacy simply didn't fit into the Egyptian vision of eternal life, where joy, abundance, and connection continued forever. As night deepens and the stars blaze overhead, you reflect on a culture where sex was life-affirming, celebrated, and rarely denied. For the ancient Egyptians, celibacy wasn't a virtue. It was a curious exception. Theirs was a world where embracing desire was part of honouring the gods and living fully in the fleeting beauty of the mortal realm. You wake to the warm light filtering through woven reed blinds and the smell of frankincense still clinging to your skin. Today, you're stepping into the world of beauty routines, but not the kind that simply keep you looking fresh for temple visits or market dealings. No, in ancient Egypt, cosmetics and spa treatments were imbued with erotic power, often doubling as secret spells designed to captivate lovers or invoke desire. It's like the ultimate ancient beauty hack, where sensuality and magic mix in fragrant oils and colourful powders. You find yourself in a perfumer's workshop, walls lined with alabaster jars filled with crushed petals, resins and spices. The artisan, a middle-aged woman with a serene smile, hands you a small pot of kohl, a smooth black paste made from galena and soot. "This isn't just for the eyes," she explains. "It wards off evil, yes, but it also enchants." Applying kohl was thought to make the wearer more alluring, sharpening the gaze and inviting intimacy. Men and women alike used it, and the ritual of application itself was considered a kind of invocation, a slow dance of seduction before it ever met another's eyes. Perfume was another essential. Kifi, a complex blend of honey, frankincense, myrrh, and other exotic ingredients, was burned as incense or worn on the body to create an aura of desire. Women would dab it behind their ears, on their wrists, and along their necks, letting the scent waft subtly in warm air. The smell was a love letter, a whisper of intention, and sometimes a kind of spell. Some recipes called for adding ingredients believed to increase sexual attraction or fertility, blurring the lines between cosmetics and magic. Your historical fact. Queen Cleopatra, though much later in Egyptian history, was famously associated with extravagant beauty rituals, baths of milk and honey, oils imported from distant lands, and perfumes so potent they were guarded as royal secrets. While some stories are legend, the tradition of sensual beauty as power stretches back thousands of years, rooted deep in Egyptian practice. Now for a quirky tidbit, ancient beauty texts sometimes prescribed love spells, disguised as makeup instructions. One papyrus advises mixing certain oils with crushed lotus petals and applying them to the lips to make the wearer irresistible. Another suggests that the act of combing hair was not just grooming, but a meditative, sensual ritual that could attract a lover's gaze. Scholars debate the extent to which beauty rituals were practical versus symbolic. Were these simply ways to enhance appearance, or did Egyptians truly believe in the magical properties of cosmetics? Evidence suggests both. Ritual and aesthetic were inseparable. Applying makeup was an act of devotion, self-care, and often enchantment. You watch as a woman in the marketplace carefully applies a cone of scented wax atop her braided hair. The wax slowly melts in the heat, releasing subtle fragrances that mingle with the dust and chatter of the street. She smiles, knowing that every gesture is part of a language of attraction and power, woven through centuries. As the day ends and you reflect on the delicate balance of beauty and desire, you realize that in ancient Egypt, the line between looking good and being magnetic was as thin as a stroke of coal. Cosmetics were more than adornment, they were an intimate dialogue, a secret invitation whispered in scent and shadow. The sun is dipping low and the air is thick with the scent of burning incense as you step into a small, dimly lit chamber where an elderly healer prepares remedies for her patients. Today, you're exploring a less glamorous but vital part of ancient Egyptian sexuality, sexually transmitted infections, STIs, and how they were understood and treated. Because yes, even in a culture that celebrated sex as sacred, unwanted consequences were a very real concern. The healer, wrapped in a simple linen shawl, greets you warmly and explains that many of her treatments blend herbal knowledge with magic. We don't just treat the body, she says, we treat the spirit, the curse, and the wound. You watch as she mixes honey, resin, and powdered roots into a thick salve, explaining that honey's antibacterial properties made it a natural medicine. It was applied to sores or ulcers thought to result from hot blood, or angry gods punishing transgressions. One common ailment was likely gonorrhea or syphilis, though the Egyptians had their own names and understandings. Papyrus texts describe symptoms like burning urination and sores, along with treatments ranging from herbal washes to magical amulets bearing protective spells. Bes, the dwarf god of fertility and protector against evil, was often invoked for healing sexual ailments. Your historical fact: the Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest medical texts from around 1550 BCE, includes numerous remedies for genitourinary diseases, mixing practical herbs with prayers and magical rituals. It's one of the earliest records showing an attempt to understand and combat STIs. Here's a fringe fact. Some believe that certain love potions or fertility charms might have doubled as treatments for sexual diseases, using aphrodisiac herbs to stimulate desire, while antimicrobial ingredients worked quietly in the background. Whether they actually cured anything or just boosted morale is up for debate. The open scholarly question is, how effective were these treatments? Modern analyses suggest that while some herbs had antimicrobial properties, others could be toxic or irritating. The magical elements, meanwhile, likely served psychological and social functions, helping patients feel protected and hopeful. In a time without antibiotics, these ancient remedies were a mix of early science and spiritual care. You watch the healer tie a small amulet around a young woman's neck, whispering a spell for cleansing and protection. It's a delicate balance between body and soul, medicine and magic. For the ancient Egyptians, healing was never just physical. It was deeply spiritual. Outside, the evening crowds mingle near the river, laughter mingling with whispers and the occasional cough. You realise that in a world where sex was joy and necessity, disease was a shadow lurking quietly behind the pleasures, a reminder that even divine gifts came with risks, and that care and caution walked hand in hand with desire. The palace is alive with murmurs and flickering candlelight as you step cautiously through its grand halls. Tonight, you're peeling back the velvet curtain on a particularly juicy subject. Did the pharaohs swing? Royal courts weren't just centres of political power, they were also hotbeds of intrigue, sensual indulgence, and whispered scandals. If you thought the ancient world was all solemn statues and ritual piety, get ready to meet the pharaohs who knew how to party hard, with concubines, feasts, and no small amount of drama. Pharaohs had multiple wives and concubines, often dozens, sometimes hundreds. These weren't just for show, they served political alliances, ensured a steady line of heirs, and, let's be honest, satisfied some serious appetites. Rameses II reportedly fathered over 100 children, so his personal life was definitely prolific. But beyond the royal harem, court life was filled with musicians, dancers, poets, and courtesans who entertained, seduced, and influenced. You enter a lavish banquet where wine flows like the Nile and exotic perfumes fill the air. Nobles recline on couches, listening to harpists and flutes, while dancers twirl and sing songs of love and desire. Among them, the pharaoh moves like a magnet, his gaze lingering on several favoured companions. The air is charged with unspoken promises, subtle glances, and the faint clink of gold jewellery. Here's your historical fact. Tomb paintings and reliefs often depict scenes of feasts with dancing and music, some clearly with erotic undertones. Archaeologists believe these gatherings weren't just formal affairs, but sometimes wild celebrations, where sexual encounters could occur openly or in private chambers. Now for a fringe fact, some ancient texts hint at parties where guests might engage in ritualised sexual acts as offerings to gods like Hathor or Bes, blurring lines between devotion and debauchery. Whether this was common or reserved for elites remains debated, but the possibility adds a spicy twist to our understanding of court life. Scholars debate the extent to which royal sexuality was political theatre versus genuine hedonism. Was the pharaoh's harem a tightly controlled institution or a sprawling playground? Did concubines wield real power, or were they merely trophies? And how much of our modern fascination with Cleopatra's lovers is myth versus fact? The truth, as usual, is layered, tantalising, and partially lost to time. As you leave the banquet, the moonlight catches a private garden where a few favoured companions share laughter and secret touches. The pharaoh's world is one of power, passion, and performance, a realm where pleasure and politics danced as closely as the courtiers themselves. You're in a dimly lit chamber filled with the scent of aged papyrus and the quiet rustle of ancient scrolls. Here lies the place where truth, myth, and a healthy dose of modern imagination collide. A final chapter exploring how we separate fact from fantasy in the stories of ancient Egyptian sexuality. Because let's face it, some of what you've heard comes wrapped in layers of legend, a little scandal and plenty of mummy porn worthy of a tabloid cover. Tonight, you're peeling back the mystique to reveal what really happened, and what's just delicious storytelling. Modern fascination with Cleopatra alone fuels an entire genre of eroticized fantasies, often ignoring that she was one of many powerful women who lived complex political lives. The image of sultry, queens draped in gold and seducing Julius Caesar or Mark Antony is part history, part Hollywood, and all too often a projection of our own desires onto the past. Ancient Egyptian sex, it turns out, was less about exoticism and more about everyday humanity. Love, power, family, and yes, pleasure. You recall the countless myths where gods embody sexuality and creation, but also the practical realities of marriage contracts, birth control, and the very human complications of jealousy and illness. The Egyptians didn't separate the divine from the mundane. Their sexuality was a tapestry woven from both sacred ritual and mundane needs. The gods taught lessons, but people lived messy, passionate, and sometimes awkward lives. Your historical fact, archaeological discoveries, from detailed papyri to everyday ostraca, show that Egyptians documented sex as part of life, not as taboo. They wrote love poetry, legal contracts, medical treatments, and even crude jokes, capturing a broad spectrum of human experience. This isn't a sanitized mythic fantasy, it's a vivid, textured reality. For a quirky twist, some modern Egyptian-themed erotica, complete with scandalous pharaohs and sultry priestesses, bears little resemblance to archaeological evidence, but says a lot about contemporary culture's obsession with the exotic. It's a reminder that history often serves as a canvas for fantasy, blurring lines and feeding our imagination. The ongoing scholarly debate centres on interpretation and representation. How do we avoid projecting modern values onto ancient societies? How do we honour their complexity without turning them into caricatures? And how much should we trust the evidence that's survived, when it's often fragmentary, symbolic, and open to multiple readings? As you close the scrolls and prepare to leave the chamber, you reflect on the journey you've taken, from divine acts of creation to whispered rooftop rendezvous, from royal bloodlines to bawdy graffiti. Ancient Egyptian sexuality was many things: sacred, practical, joyful, and complicated. It was as human as it was divine, and maybe that's the greatest truth of all.